Have you ever tried to walk through a door that clearly wasn't for you? You know the kind of door I'm talking about, maybe one that has the sign in front of it, authorized personnel only. Do not enter. What do we think when we see signs like that? Well, clearly, this is not a place that just anyone can go into. You think of examples of this: the operating room, the cockpit, the evidence room. You need some sort of qualification in order to enter such an important place. You need an MD, you need a pilot's license, you need security clearance, right? That makes sense to us. So whenever we see a sign like this, authorized personnel only, you don't think, oh, wow, how rude. You think, yeah, that makes sense. Right? We kind of get the idea that the closer you get to what is most powerful, most precious, most dangerous, the higher the standards need to be who can come in. The more careful you have to be. In Leviticus, chapters 21 through 23, or 21 through 22, are basically God putting a sign over the tabernacle that says, authorized personnel only. Okay, I'll call you to turn over to Leviticus. We are back in Leviticus. We took a big, long hiatus for about a month and a half. So it's everyone's favorite book, right? The easiest one to read, not dense at all, most encouraging book in the world. But I really do believe this is a very important book of the Bible. It's actually foundational for our understanding of the entire rest of the Bible. So if you would turn over to it. Just as a quick recap, where are we in the book of Leviticus? Well, Leviticus, it has been teaching us again and again and again this truth: God is holy, and people cannot just waltz into His presence like it's no big deal. So, God, in mercy, He provides a way for His people to live near Him, being holy as He is holy. That's the idea of Leviticus. Leviticus, it has a mirror-like shape. You can see up here on the screen. We are now in the second half of Leviticus, and so what we're doing is we're revisiting themes from the first half, but from a different angle. And so back in chapters 8 through 10, we saw that priests were ordained for tabernacle service. But now, in chapters 21 and 22, we're seeing how priests must behave in their service. What qualifies or disqualifies them in that service? And this is the principle we're going to see over the course of the message today, that the greater the responsibility, the greater the standard. If you are just visiting a hospital, there are rules. But if you're performing surgery, there are stricter rules, right? If you are dining at a restaurant, there are expectations. But if you're the one cooking the food, there are much higher expectations. In the same way, in Leviticus, the priests, they were among those with the highest level of responsibility. They handled the holy things. They stood before the altar. They represented the people before God. So God says, you are called to a higher standard. You must be holy as I am holy, representing holiness. You must be unblemished. Everyone say unblemished. That's the key word for today. And so, looking at the text, we see in the very first movement of the text, God calls for unblemished priests. We see that in chapter 21, verse 1 through 22, verse 16. This section, it has lots of rules and regulations about how priests should act, what is required in order to handle the priestly responsibilities, who can eat the holy food, when, and under what conditions. And these all revolve around previously defined categories of cleanliness. We've talked about this a lot before in Leviticus. So without explaining all of that all over again, I just want to walk through some of these and ask why these matter. What's the significance of these? The first thing I want to point out, one way that their priests are called to be unblemished, is that they're called to be unblemished in their grieving, because they're called to represent life. If you would look at verses 1 through 6 here of chapter 21. It says, "And the Lord said to Moses, Speak to the priests, the son of Aaron, sons of Aaron, and say to them, no one shall make himself unclean for the dead among his people, except for his closest relatives, his mother, his father, his son, his daughter, his brother, or his virgin sister, who is near to him, because she has had no husband. For her he may make himself unclean. He shall not make himself unclean as a husband among his people, and so profane himself. They shall not make bald patches on their heads, nor shave the edges of their beards, nor make any cuts on their body. They shall be holy to their God, and not profane the name of their God, for they offer the Lord's food offerings, the bread of their God. Therefore they shall be holy. So this section is setting limits on how priests can have contact with the dead, and in particular, mourning practices. And this can feel maybe cold to our modern sensibilities until you remember what the tabernacle was communicating. Death was the sign of the fall. It was the consequence of sin. It was the great uncleanness that spreads. Therefore, the man who ministered in the place of God's life and holiness was not to carry these symbols of death casually into those spaces. So part of the point here also, in addition to that, is to be avoiding pagan mourning practices, things based on superstition, based on idol worship. We have mention here of particular kinds of grooming that was related to pagan practices, ritual cutting of the body. What we're getting here is that God does not want his priests handling death in the same way these pagan nations do. In all things relating to death, the priest had to be a picture of life, and was all a part of the symbolism of the tabernacle. The next big thing I think we see here, one big thing I call your attention to, is that priests must be unblemished in their marriages. Why? Because they're called to represent faithfulness. Continue reading with me, starting from verse 7. They shall not marry a prostitute or a woman who has been defiled. Neither shall they marry a woman divorced from her husband, or the priest is holy to his God. For the priest is holy to his God. You shall sanctify him, for he offers the bread of your God. He shall be holy to you, for I, the Lord, who sanctify you, am holy. And the daughter of any priest, if she profanes herself by whoring, profanes her father, she shall be burned with fire. The priest who is chief among his brothers, on whose head the anointing oil is poured, and on who has been consecrated to wear the garments, shall not let the hair of his head hang loose, nor tear his clothes. He shall not go into any dead bodies, nor make himself unclean for even his father or for his mother. He shall not go out of the sanctuary, lest he profane the sanctuary of his God, for he shall take a wife in her virginity. A widow or a divorced woman, or a woman who has been defiled, or a prostitute, these he shall not marry. But he shall take as his wife a virgin of his own people, that he may not profane his offspring among his people. For I am the Lord who sanctifies him. So God is not only concerned here with what happens at the altar, he is also concerned with what happens in the home of his priestly leaders. Because no one is able to sustain carrying a holy responsibility publicly while living in a situation of unholiness privately. The private life always leaks into the public. And so what this is doing is God being protective. He sees and he knows the kind of havoc that comes into a community when its leaders have divided families. He knows that sexual compromise spreads, leading to scandal, leading to divided loyalties. So you got to know at this point in time, sex with temple prostitutes was a very common thing in the nearby pagan worship. Therefore, God wants his priests to be totally set apart from any kind of behavior like that. He doesn't want the priest to have any sort of likeness to what the nearby nations look like. And the reason for a lot of these other rules, not everything here is immoral necessarily or unclean. We got to make that point, It talks about widows. There's nothing, wrong about marrying a widow. However, specifically for the priests, we got to recognize this point that paternity mattered quite a bit. And so the priesthood, it was a hereditary thing. It all came from the tribe of Levi. And so an uncertain lineage, it undermined the authority of the priesthood. And that whole system was not to be undermined under God's law. And so, therefore, in all things relating to family and all things relating to sexuality, the priest had to be a picture of faithfulness. Here's the last thing I'll just show you from this part of the text. There's a lot of things you could break down here. Here's the third thing. Priests must be unblemished in their bodies. In their bodies. Why? Because they're meant to represent unbrokenness. Look over at, let's say, verse 16. We'll start reading from there. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to Aaron, saying, None of your offspring throughout their generations who has a blemish may approach to offer the bread of his God, for no one who has a blemish shall draw near, a man blind or lame, or one who has a mutilated face or a limb too long, or a man who has an injured foot or an injured hand, or a hunchback or a dwarf, or a man with a defect in his sight, or an itching disease, or scabs or crushed testicles. Don't be mad at me for saying it. It's in the Bible, okay? No man of the offspring of Aaron the priest who has a blemish shall come near to offer the Lord's food offerings. Since he has a blemish, he shall not come near to offer the bread of his God. He shall eat the bread of his God, both of the most holy and of the holy things, but he shall not go through the veil or approach the altar because he has a blemish, that he may not profane my sanctuaries, for I am the Lord who sanctifies them. So Moses spoke to Aaron and to his sons and to all the people of Israel. So this is a list of physical blemishes that would disqualify a priest from that high level of altar service. I wonder, do you think that we're slacking by not bringing any of these qualifications up in our membership interviews? Hey, you want to join the church? You have any itching diseases? A leg too long for, the other? How's the condition of your testicles? Like, of course we don't bring that stuff up, right? That would be weird to our modern sensibilities. Okay? All right, I said it, all right? It's in the Bible. It's in the Bible. But perhaps there's a higher purpose in this stuff. I mean, this might even seem weird, but it might even seem unfair, right? Why is it that a person with these defects would not be allowed to exercise the full priestly service? Well, I don't think this is in accordance with the American with Disabilities Act. Okay, so what's the deal here? Well, although it may seem unfair, I'll have you think about it this way. We should not be like a kid who is upset that they can't ride the roller coaster because they're not tall enough. They don't meet the height requirements. Perhaps there is a higher purpose, a lesson in this for our good if we humble ourselves. What is that higher purpose? Okay, I would say this, a kind of symbolism. At the altar of the tabernacle, God wanted to communicate that he was without any kind of unbrokenness, that his standard is unbrokenness. Therefore, in all things visible, in all things bodily, the priest had to be a symbol, a picture of unbrokenness. And that's not meant to put down the broken, right? It's worth noting, a priest with a physical defect, he was not rejected as worthless. He was still allowed to eat the food in the holy place. He was still a part of that community. People with disabilities, they're not second-class citizens in God's kingdom. Every single part of the family of God is an essential part. They're beloved. Okay? And by the way, every single one of us has some kind of defect too. The passage that we're reading here is not a permission slip to treat those with physical brokenness as lesser. Instead, what it's designed to do is the opposite. It should make us hunger for the day when every form of brokenness, physical and spiritual, is healed. That's what God's doing here. I mean, look, if you look at this whole section, do you see the pattern? Okay? The things that the priests are meant to be pictures of: life, faithfulness, unbrokenness. These are all pictures of a pre-fall state. A state that God is intending to restore to the creation. Therefore, these are pictures of God's character. These are pictures of God's standard he calls his people to. And one of the ways he does that is through how the priests are meant to model these things. This was not only a standard for the priests, by the way, this was a standard for the sacrifices as well. When a priest approached God presenting an animal, he was not only presenting the animal, he was presenting himself alongside it. So they had to be of similar stuff, which brings me to our next point. Let's jump ahead a little bit. Go over to 22 verse 17. Here we see God calls for unblemished sacrifices. Starting from verse 17, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to Aaron and his sons and all the people of Israel, and say to them, When any one of the house of Israel or of the sojourners in Israel presents a burnt offering as his offering, for any of their vows or free will offerings that they offer to the Lord, if it is to be accepted for you, it shall be a male without blemish, of the bulls or the sheep or the goats. You shall not offer anything that has a blemish, for it will not be acceptable for you. And when anyone offers a sacrifice of peace offerings to the Lord to fulfill a vow, or as a freewill offering from the herd or from the flock, to be accepted, it must be perfect. There shall be no blemish in it. Animals, blind or disabled or mutilated or having a discharge or an itch or scabs, you shall not offer to the Lord or give them to the Lord as a food offering on the altar. You may present a bull or a lamb that has a part too long or too short for a freewill offering, but for a vow offering it cannot be accepted. Any animal that has its testicles bruised or crushed or torn or cut, you shall not offer to the Lord. You shall not do it within your land, neither shall you offer as the bread of your God any such animals gotten from a foreigner. Since there is a blemish in them because of their mutilation, they shall not be accepted for you." So we'll return specifically to some larger ideas behind this idea later. But for now, let's just ask the larger question, okay? As we've discussed, if the priests and sacrifices were pointing forward to the day when God would restore all things to an unblemished state, how and when is that restoration going to come? Well, the answer clearly is in Jesus. He comes to fulfill what was incomplete in Leviticus. See, Israel needed a better priest. The whole system testified to that reality. Israel needed a better priest. Even the outwardly unblemished priests were inwardly blemished. So no priest was fully fit to actually represent the people. Likewise, Israel also needed a better sacrifice. No animal was fully fit to atone for sin. See, Jesus, he is both. He is both the better priest and the better sacrifices. These former things were only symbolically unblemished. But Jesus, he is truly unblemished. He is spotless, without defect, without sin. He is the only one whose blood was actually acceptable to atone for sin. The only one who could stand in God's presence without any kind of disqualifying uncleanness. And just as sacrificial lambs were wrapped in swaddling clothes before being presented at the temple, so we read in the gospel account of Luke that Jesus was wrapped in the same way with swaddling clothes, identifying him from his birth that the cross was his destiny. This was his purpose. On the cross, Jesus presented himself as the unblemished priest, an unblemished sacrifice, in order to declare us unblemished before God. And guess what? We need that. Because every one of us has some kind of blemish. It may be physical. It may be spiritual. There is always a spiritual blemish. But every single one of us fails to be a perfect picture of God in human form. The only one who has ever been a perfect picture of God in flesh is Jesus. So, Jesus, he took on sin's penalty. He bore death in our place so that all who trust in him could be declared unblemished. And that status is not something we achieve. It is something Christ achieves, but it is freely given to us as a gift. This is the gospel. How do we see the gospel in Leviticus? By how it's fulfilled in Jesus. So how do we live this out? Okay? We've read through this text. How do we live this stuff out? Well, number one, I think we can just, the first application is, let's celebrate that Jesus fulfilled this. Okay? If that was all there is, that's enough. Okay? However, I think we should also ask a second question. Now that Jesus has accomplished once and for all what the Old Covenant only pictured, how does he call us to live in light of it? And to that end, I think this passage is very instructive. It's instructive for all Christians, because if at any point you tuned out of this message thinking, well, good thing I'm not a priest, the New Testament has some news for you, okay? You are. Not in the Old Covenant sense. There's no tabernacle, no offerings of sacrificed animals that you have to give, but you are a priest in your identity and calling in the New Covenant. Peter says that all believers, this is what he calls them, are a holy priesthood, a royal priesthood, a people set apart to declare God's excellencies. Paul, he says that we hold the gospel out to the world as a priestly offering. So we are, in our identity and our calling, priests. Wearing funny robes and hailing allegiance to the Pope does not make you a priest, okay? Jesus makes you a priest. All right? So as priests, anyone who's a part of God's kingdom, this passage is instructive for us. It's also instructive for Christian leaders. Not only are Christian leaders priests, they have an elevated priestly role. You know, of course, the Old Testament priesthood is gone, but I think the principle remains that the leaders of God's people are held to a higher standard. Why? Well, because I believe the community needs visible models of holiness to follow. See, there were many requirements that were only strictly enforced for the priests, but yet were meant to be instructive for how all God's people should live. Remember the restaurant analogy from earlier. If you go into a restaurant as a diner, there's some expectations, but the people cooking the food have higher expectations, right? Okay? Well, the reverse is also true, where the expectations, the standards that those people with higher responsibility are called to, sometimes are lessons for the people with lower responsibility that they might follow too. You ever go into a restaurant bathroom and see a sign that says, employees must wash hands? I think that should apply to everybody, okay? Personally, that's my opinion, all right? I know, listen, I've been in the bathroom with some of y'all. I know you don't follow that one. But anyway, in the same way, Scripture gives elders and deacons a list of qualifications that they're called to follow that aren't qualifications for every single member of a local church. But the idea is that as we do those kinds of things, the whole community does those things. It's an example to follow. So for those of us here who are at Calvary, who hold positions of leadership, we've got to take that higher responsibility seriously. I mean, we should be a people who can say, like Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11, imitate me as I imitate Christ. Okay, so with all that said, as Christians, and especially as Christians leaders, how should we live as priests? Well, I think this text is revealing at least two principles, each of which kind of come with each of the two movements we've already looked at. So, number one, be an unblemished priest by taking God seriously, not casually. See, there's a reason why God gave priests such careful instructions for how they were to approach him and handle holy things. Because God is worth your care and your intentionality. In the church, I am far less concerned about some big scandal than I am about a slow, casual drift into comfortable Christianity, where your worship becomes this monotonous routine, where you take the gospel for granted, where you profess with your lips Christ is Lord, but your hearts are far from him, and your life does not reveal him in any kind of meaningful way. See, the passage warns here, do not profane God's name. That's the continual warning. And that means more than just not cussing in our day and age. You profane God's name anytime you declare to belong to him, but yet your life makes him look small. That is what that means today. He is the almighty God of the universe. He's kind of a big deal, okay? And he expects your life to reflect that. Let me just say, we get this wrong today, okay? We who are graced to be in the new covenant often just act like, well, because I'm a Christian and I'm not under the old covenant, I can kind of just be a little bit more casual about my lifestyle and relationship with God. I don't have to be so reverent anymore because God's loosened up or something. No! Okay? God hasn't loosened up. His character hasn't changed. Yes, it's true that we have greater access now to God through Jesus. We have astonishing access, actually, where you don't have to go into a tabernacle, the Holy of Holy Places, in order to interact and sit in the presence of God. You can be and relate with God anywhere, anytime. Okay, that's the beauty of the gospel. But the New Testament does not say you can treat God like a buddy that you can ignore or hang out with whenever you want. Okay, the New Testament, in Hebrews, it says, draw near with confidence. You can because of Jesus, but do so with reverence. This is the biblical teaching in the New Testament about how we draw near to God. So when we gather here, as we're called to do, or whenever we gather and meet with God privately, let me challenge you, we should come with just as much seriousness and respect as any Old Testament priest was called to come with. Why? The Old Covenant, or the covenants are different, the practices are different, but God is not different. Yes, there is much that separates us from an Old Covenant priest, but not as much as sometimes we act like. God has not changed. And since God has not changed, our quality of worship should not be any different. If anything, rather than being lesser, it should be greater. I mean, think, have we not received greater grace from God now? Have we not seen more promises revealed? Do we not have an even greater picture of God's glory? If anything, our worship quality should not go down, it should go up. Here is my concern, okay, if I can present to you my concern. Sometimes I believe people treat God's graciousness as a reason for being flippant with God. But grace, it is not meant to be abused. Think of it this way. If you mess up and you mistreat your mom is likely to forgive you, right? Because it's your mom. She loves you. She has abundant grace for you. You can mess up 100 times and mistreat her accidentally in 100 different ways, and she'll take you back in because she's a loving mother. However, you should not recognize that and say, oh, well, I got room to mistreat my mom whenever it benefits me. No. If anything, the fact that she would have such grace for you should give you a reason for treating her better, not worse. I mean, what determines how you treat someone should not be how much you can get away with. That's a bad metric for determining how you treat people. I remember my dad, very frustrated one time, telling me a story about a student who turned in a bunch of late assignments at the very last minute, creating a lot of work for him that he wasn't expecting. And the student explained it like, well, you should understand because I've been prioritizing my coursework for another professor, a stricter professor than you. Wait, whoa. So you're telling me that since you knew I would be more gracious, you treated my class less important? I mean, why treat someone worse because they're willing to give you more grace? If anything, it should be the reverse. You know, it's ugly whenever we do that to each other. How much uglier is it whenever we do that to God? Because we know He is so abundantly gracious. I mean, ask yourself this question. Sit with this question for a second. Am I treating God flippantly because I know I can get away with it with God? Because I know He's gracious? Would it take a less gracious God to get your obedience? Would it take a harsher God to get your respect and your reverence? And if so, does that concern you? As you sit with that, let me offer another way that we might apply this passage. Offer an unblemished sacrifice by giving your God your best, not your leftovers. See, in the second movement we've read about the sacrifices, we see God's very clear. No blemished offerings, right? So no lame animals, no blind animals, no broken animals, no, hey, this one's basically broken, let's give it to God. God's not being a picky snob here. What is he teaching? He is teaching that the quality of your worship reveals what you believe God is worth. God is saying, if you know who I am, don't treat me like I'm cheap. This lesson, it goes back as far as Cain and Abel, right? And they're different quality offerings. If what you're offering is meant to be a sacrifice, then let it be a sacrifice. That's why it's called that. If it doesn't cost you anything or cost you hardly anything, then it's not really a sacrifice acceptable to the Lord. See, the quality of the gift we give says something about our heart to the one we give it to. If I give my wife Jules a gift that was essentially an afterthought, I can say, hey, well, it's the thought that counts. And she will rightly say, yeah, and your thought was not much. Okay? If I give her something that has no love or attention or care, something that was broken or last minute, then that reveals a lack of love I have for her. And so if we give God the worst that we have, but keep the best for ourselves, what does that communicate? Do we bring God today's equivalent of a bruised, limping, broken animal and call it enough? What are we bringing to God as our offering? Is it our leftover time? Our distracted worship? Our giving that never sacrifices personal comfort? Half-sung worship, half-hearted prayers that are more performative for other people than they are conversations with God? Perhaps a way of organizing church life that is based upon our personal preferences. We have to ask these kinds of things. What are we really offering to God? And in contrast, what are we giving our best to instead? What are we reserving the best of those things for? I mean, do you spend the first and last minutes of every day on your phone, but then you can't squeeze in time to spend focused prayer and scripture reading with God? Do you sing the loudest and most passionately at a concert or in your car listening to secular radio, but then whenever we come and we gather and we try to sing praises to God, it's just kind of mumbling? There's nothing in your heart there? Does your schedule have margin for every sports games, every fun opportunity, every personal ambition, but not enough to attend regularly the gathering of God's people? We have to ask, what are all these things communicating about how we prioritize the Lord? Now, I'm not here to shame you. I am not. But I am calling you from the Scripture to consider, what would giving God your best, not your leftovers, look like instead? What would that look like? Think on that question. Paul, he tells us. Romans chapter 12, verses 1 through 2. He says, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. That is surrendering every area of your whole life to God. And so let's be clear. What's the reason we do this? What's the reason why we seek to be an unblemished priest? What's the reason why we seek to give an unblemished sacrifice? Well, that why is really key here. And a lot of times people can get this wrong. Perhaps you misheard me today, okay? Let me give you a hint. The why is not to earn our salvation. Okay? Paul says the why right here. The mercies of God. He says, in view of the mercies of God, I appeal to you, brothers, to offer your sacrifice, yourself as a sacrifice. What is the reason we offer this sacrifice? What is the reason we present ourselves and our things in this way before God? As a response. Our sacrificial offering is a response to God's sacrificial offering. See, some of you are exhausted because you have turned Christianity into a performance. That is not what I'm suggesting. In fact, the truth is, like the Old Testament priests, you can never offer enough. So if you try, you're always going to fail. But because God has offered enough for you on your behalf, you are simply called to offer all you can in your weakness and by His strength. Why are we called to give God our very best? Because He has given us His very best. We should give unto God what is akin to a spotless lamb sacrifice because we have received as a sacrifice the true spotless lamb. That is the rationale behind why we live in this seeking after the unblemished state that God calls us to. We don't do it to earn access. We do it because we've already been given access to God. After God calls us holy, He turns around and says, now act like it. And we can't get this reversed. We cannot get this reversed. God does not say here, be holy so I will be your God. No, God says in 22:31 through 33, He says, I am your God. I rescued you. Now be holy. That's a very particular order we cannot ever forget. It is because of the covenant that God has with His people, a covenant He kept by saving them, that He calls them to be holy. It is a response. If that was true of Israel, saved from under the oppression and slavery to Egypt, how much more true of it is that for us? We who have been saved under the oppression and slavery of sin and death. Our covenant is far better. We have been saved to be a part of an everlasting covenant. And so, I'll close with just 3 questions. And I'll call you to think about these 3 questions and ask which of these applies to me. And just sit with these questions, let these questions ruminate in you. Number 1, are you outside the covenant? Do you need, by salvation that comes from God, to enter into God's covenant, to receive that better priest, that better sacrifice, that better cleansing that comes from God? Are you in the covenant, but are you exhausted? You've been working and working, trying to perform to receive what you've already been given. Today, do you need to simply rest in the gift of Jesus? Rest in this God who sanctifies you. And the third question, are you in this covenant? And you know it, but if you're honest with yourself, you've gone casual. You've been giving God your leftovers, not your best. But you've been calling it enough. Sit in these questions. And in a moment as we sing, I'll call you to just reflect on how the Lord might be guiding you in this. What He may be convicting you of. And when we sing, I call you to let the words we sing be a reflection of a transformation that's happening in our heart, which is total surrender unto God. Whichever of these 3 questions is the one that applies to you, I think the answer is the same. Come to Jesus. See, the law, it puts a sign over the tabernacle that says authorized personnel only. But the gospel, it gives us Jesus. And so it says Jesus is the authorized personnel, and he opens the door so that you can come in. And so I'd call you, as we respond in song, walk through the door that Jesus has opened for you. You may not be authorized. You may not be without blemish. None of us are. None of us are without any blemish. Every single one of us have something that's corrupt and broken in us. We don't rely on ourselves to be authorized. We rely on Christ, who is authorized, and he has opened the door, declaring us authorized by the entrance he gives us. And so as we sing, let the Lord convict you, and let the song that comes out of your mouth reveal something true that's happening in your soul. Sing with me.